anyway, we talked about these general areas of, what we do and how much we accept certain positions. And we had these categories: pluralism, right? It's definitely acceptable. Tolerance, we may not agree with it, but we put up with it. And then there's deviance, things that are definitely wrong, and maybe we tolerate them even though they're definitely wrong, and maybe we don't, right? So think of an issue in the Jewish community over which, we might apply one of these categories, right? So for instance, do we ordain rabbis who are homosexuals, right? That's kind of shifted a little bit in recent years, right? So where would we categorize that? You would say, some people would say pluralism. Some people are still a little uncomfortable with it, but they would most of them would probably say that it's in the tolerance realm, right? Give me another issue. Something a little controversial.
Well, go to a trans rabbi.
Right, so, yeah. Some people would say, well, of course, right? Some people would say, not so sure, but we'll tolerate it, right? Some people might say, trans rabbis. Right? Some people could go with that, even if they felt that it was a deviant position. And some people might say, no, that's off the table.
I guess if you're Reform or Orthodox, that might make a difference.
Absolutely. Right? So let's take another issue. Abortion, right? So, I would say at Beth Yeshurun, most people would put that in this camp, right? Some other people might say, well, I don't accept that position, but I can live with it, especially if I don't have to know about it, right? So put it in there, yeah?
But, don't the Orthodox allow abortions for certain conditions?
Absolutely.
Rabbi Feinstein.
Absolutely.
He wrote a bunch of things on the subject.
Yes, I haven't read them all, but I'm aware.
No, but the point was, it's not such a big issue, they said, certain situations.
It is a big issue, but it's complicated, and there's a large realm of acceptance of abortion in a way that's not true in the evangelical Christian community, right? Let's take another issue. Where would we fit something in here? Any issue, little controversy.
Kosher could be one.
Yes, right? Well, yeah, kashrut, okay? So let's assume, for instance, that we're talking about kashrut within the synagogue. We'll just, to make this simple, okay? So you want your synagogue to provide kosher at all times. Everything in the synagogue should be kosher. And somebody comes along and says, well, I want to bring in something that's not kosher. That would be considered
intolerable.
an issue of deviance and probably not tolerable, right? Right, because either it is kosher or it isn't, right?
But like Beth Yeshurun has Rabbi Horwitz over here.
Yes, yes.
So that's kosher, but you're a conservative synagogue, right?
Yeah. Well, the issue is not who the supervisor is. A smaller synagogue, maybe the rabbi of the synagogue is the one responsible for everything here. I mean, Beth Yeshurun is like, there's stuff going on here 28 hours a day. So and the rabbi himself has, an 80-hour work week? So, yeah, I like to tell people that I only work 40 hours a week. I'm a part-time. Right? So, it's kind of true. So, it doesn't matter who the supervisor is. That's only an issue maybe within the Orthodox realm. Yeah, right?
Being overshadowed.
Okay, so that's really a personal issue. So when you apply it to the community, right? Let's say that you have a synagogue where everybody is Shomer Shabbat, and then you have guests who come who are not, right? So that, we'll just put this,
He's not here today.
I don't know of an Orthodox synagogue that would tolerate having people who were not Shomer Shabbat, and in fact, I know of, no modern Orthodox synagogues where everybody is Shomer Shabbat, right? So, yeah, there are realms, there would be areas of deviance that would be more problematic. So, if you had someone come into the synagogue on Saturday and flick a light switch, right? So in a synagogue where this is a major standard, that, you might not throw them out, right? Might be a little bit tolerable, but you're certainly gonna say something to them.
What if your cell phone rings and they answer it?
Yeah, you're gonna, here's my solution to that, by the way. I tell everybody that, if your cell phone rings on Shabbat, we're gonna collect the cell phones to use for a very holy purpose. We're gonna use them for tashlich. That's called not tolerable. But, that's just.
That's what you should do in schools.
We wouldn't actually. Okay, so, some of these things have definitely shifted over time, right? I mean, these gender issues, they've all shifted in my lifetime. Yeah.
I bet it's not an organ, but that instrument.
cable.
Musical accompaniment in a synagogue,
Yeah.
right? So in some synagogues, that would definitely be treated as deviance, right? At Beth Yeshurun, it's like over here, right?
Yeah.
At least in the sanctuary service, right? Because it's actually written into the charter of the synagogue that there will be an organ in the sanctuary. My response to that, by the way, is they don't have to play it.
They don't have to what? They don't have to
They
what?
don't have
Yeah.
the organ. They don't play the organ, but they.
I know, it's
Oh, they don't have to play
shifted
it.
to a little people, right?
That's written into the Constitution?
Of the synagogue, I believe so. I've never read the synagogue charter,
I
but
don't know.
that's my
I think
understanding.
Rabbi Morgan mentioned that during the conversion class.
Yeah.
When the two synagogues came together, that was one point.
Oh.
Yeah, and so, all those things got negotiated out and got set in stone in ways that, nobody could have predicted would be dealt with 75 years later. You know, nobody thought there would be, you know, instead of an organ, this very somber organ that they used to have back in the 60s, right? And now you have, you know, the band playing with the cantor once a month and all sorts of interesting permutations. Yeah, right.
Women on the Bema.
Women on the Bema. See, now again, this is one that just, you know,
It just
for
happened.
for most of us, it's kind of normative, right? Whereas in certain synagogues, you could be all the way over here, right? Because we don't have women taking a public role. That's just the way it is. some
You want
places.
another one, or you want to move?
One more,
on?
one more.
Okay. Marrying, mixed marriages.
Intermarriage, right,
I'm not gonna-
right. So, that's a great example because we have a complicated position. Okay, so if we're talking about the rabbi in a conservative synagogue officiating an intermarriage, that's considered deviance. All
Even
right,
here, even here.
Yeah.
even here,
Yes.
Right?
Rabbi Rosen
Yeah.
once told me that.
yeah, and for that matter, conservative rabbis, members of the rabbinical assembly, are subject to expulsion.
That's what Rabbi
Really?
If they
Rosen
do
told
that.
me.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, you didn't know?
So,
Yeah.
you know, so some rabbis, and I don't do this, but some rabbis will say to couples, look, you know, I'd love to be able to help you, but my union doesn't allow it. Yeah, I mean, the way I tell it to people is, you know, I'm not licensed to perform just any marriage, right? I am only licensed as a traditional rabbi to perform marriages between two Jews, right? So if you're talking about performing intermarriages, then you're gonna be somewhere over here and maybe all the way over here, right? But if you're talking about intermarrieds as members of a congregation,
They can.
and we have a fair number of those, right? It's like, it's accepted that we have members of the synagogue who are married out, and in fact, that, you know, the non-Jewish spouse is also considered a member of the synagogue for a variety of purposes. I don't think we ever had an officer who was a, you know, non-Jewish spouse.
So in that
But-
case, do the children usually go to Hebrew school?
Well,
That's something.
it just depends, right? If the family are, you know, the parents are raising the children as Jewish, and if they are considered Jewish according to Jewish law, which of course is always the case if the mother is the Jewish one, and if the children have been converted, which usually takes place very early, if the father is the Jewish one, so then, yeah, all, you know, the children would be educated in the synagogue and the day school and so forth, right? So the, you know, as far as membership is concerned, you know, it would definitely be at this end, right? So that's, you know, that's why sometimes it seems there's a little dissonance between those two edges.
What about same-sex marriages?
Same-sex marriages,
That we talked
well,
that we talked about.
post 2006, right, when the law committee basically affirmed both same-sex marriages and the ordination of homosexual rabbis, right? So it didn't take very long, you know, considering how long it sometimes takes for changes to come around. It didn't take very long for that to become normative at Beth Yeshurun, right? I mean, what year was it that Rabbi Rosen basically went to the board and said, I'm prepared to do a gay marriage? And it was less than 10 years ago.
Yeah, I saved his letter.
Uh-huh,
justifying it.
yeah, yeah.
How many have you actually done?
So
Rabbi?
that moved from over here to over here in a very brief period of time. And the reason for that is very simple. It's because we've had a sea change in how we understand sexuality, just, in our lifetimes. Right? So, okay, so, any last questions or
I
comments
was
before we
just
go
wondering,
on?
in
What about reading
Israel-
from the Torah?
So what's the question about reading?
Look, is that, on the Orthodox, they won't let women read from the Torah.
Right, my granddaughter.
Right, so again, that's just a, one of those
They
you
do,
know,
but in
general
the,
gender issues, right? And in the Orthodox world, that would be considered deviant, although in some situations, like in a women's service, some Orthodox synagogues, create a space for that. But, at Beth Yeshurun and most conservative synagogues, that would be considered normative. That would be pluralist.
But not in the chapel.
But yes, the chapel is always different.
But in Israel, in terms of a marriage between a Christian and a Jew, or a Muslim and a Jew, do they have civil marriages? I mean, but what, and then what about?
Israel does not
I know,
legitimize civil marriages within Israel.
right,
They recognize civil marriages that are performed
so
elsewhere.
that's what they do.
So what a lot of Israelis do
They're gonna
is,
start
it's a whole industry of, going to
Yeah,
Cyprus to
that's
get
what I-
married,
Yeah.
right?
that's
You
what-
get the marriage and the honeymoon all in the same place.
Okay. When I used to travel, I went to Charleston, West Virginia, a very old Jewish Orthodox area. They brought, the old rabbi died, and they brought in a young rabbi, and Rabbi Lamb from the Orthodox Union came to make sure everything was set up right. So anyway, as it turned out, on Shabbos, they had a Reform rabbi who worked at the Reform congregation, and he came every Shabbos over there. And they allowed him to pray, they gave him arenas. But when there were occasions when they needed somebody to perform a marriage, a funeral, they wouldn't recognize him at all.
Right. In other words, as a Jew,
Yeah,
he was 100% accepted,
right.
right? As a rabbi, he was 0% accepted, right? Now,
And he recognized that, because.
that's how I think I would be treated in most Orthodox synagogues, right? That's been my experience in Orthodox synagogues. I mean, and, in modern Orthodox synagogues, most of them will refer to me as Rabbi Horwitz, even if they don't allow me rabbinic privileges within the synagogue, right? So, there's a difference between legitimization and courtesy. So anyway, I've dealt with that my whole career, right? And by the way, that, there are all sorts of things where I wouldn't necessarily ask a Reform rabbi to do certain things. But that's more for practical reasons rather than my not recognizing their, rabbinic credentials, right? If I'm doing a conversion, all right, I want that conversion to be maximally recognized. Understanding that there are gonna be elements in the Orthodox world that will never recognize anything that I do, right? Nonetheless, I want it to be maximally recognized. And having a Reform rabbi sign on one of those certificates would be a red flag. So, out of concern for that person's status, maybe they want to make Aliyah down the road, right? I want to make things easier for them and not harder.
Does Israel recognize a conservative
Conversion.
Generally not.
That's what I thought.
However, there are exceptions. And it's a complicated subject, not gonna go into that now. Let me ask you to turn in your booklets to page 10. We're gonna take a look at the text from these, from this unit. Right? So, the first text, this is a piece from Maimonides, right? So, someone want to volunteer to read this for us? Just the English, okay? Yeah, please, go ahead.
When a person believes in all these fundamental principles and his faith is thus clarified, he is then part of that Israel, and we are to love him, pity him, and treat him as God commanded with love and fellowship. Even if a Jew should commit every possible sin out of lust or mastery by his lower nature, he will be punished for his sins, but he will still have a share in the world to come. He is one of the sinners in Israel. But if a man gives up any one of these fundamental principles, he has removed himself from the Jewish community. He is an atheist, a heretic, and an unbeliever who cuts among the plantings. We are commanded to hate him and destroy him. Of him it is said, shall I not hate those who hate you, O Lord?
Mhm. Don't get the idea that Maimonides is a big liberal, right? Kind of. Maimonides says that the essence of being Jewish is to believe in certain things. You may not be the most righteous Jew, but if you believe the right things, then yes, you have a share in the world to come. And if you don't, you are in big trouble.
Okay, so which one of these Hebrew qualifications do they call people courses with this and that?
Yeah,
So
I don't want to get into that, Jerry.
The
That's,
fundamental principles.
yeah, I mean, this is not necessarily about, what specifically makes you an apicurus or a heretic, right?
But they're
The
called.
point is that Maimonides has these categories, all right? So he's got pluralism. You believe the right stuff, you do the right stuff, you're good. You believe the right stuff, but maybe you don't always do the right stuff, so you're tolerated. You don't believe the right stuff.
That's harsh.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Hate him,
Maimonides
destroy him.
is brutal on this subject.
Oh my God, yeah.
You don't want to mess with him if you don't believe the right stuff, better find another Jewish philosopher, or something, hate him and destroy him. Yes, that's kind of harsh. But Maimonides didn't live among Christians. He lived basically among Muslims. So their attitude toward Muslims was very accepting because after all, they are, they're not idolaters and they're at least most of them were not persecuting Jews. And they respected the role of the Jewish people. So, it was easier in that culture to emphasize the specific Jewish beliefs that people had, and to say those are, that's the crown of Judaism. And you don't mess with the crown. Get there.
Okay, which one of my Rambam's books does he talk about?
Well, Perek Chelek, I think, is in his commentary to the Mishnah.
Okay, but what, didn't he call the Muslims Meshiga? Right?
He may have said that at one point or another. I haven't read the entire corpus of Maimonides' writings. But, yeah, I mean, you could, and also there are times when Maimonides changes his position between different books that he wrote, because they're spread over his lifetime, right? I wouldn't worry about that. it would not today be an excuse to agree with that position. Okay, so, you know, could we build a community today based on Maimonides' boundaries?
No.
I don't think so.
Mm-mm.
Be pretty tough, right? Say you have to believe these things, otherwise we kick you out of the community, essentially. That would not go over very well.
Sounds like a cult.
It would, yeah, it didn't function that
Yeah, I
way,
know, but now.
but it would look like it now,
Mhm.
right? Okay, number 2, this piece from the Talmud Masechet Chulin. Someone else want to read for us?
I'll read it.
Please.
One should accept sacrifices from the transgressors in Israel so that they may be inclined to repent, but not from an Israelite, the Shumad, one who is destroyed, or from one who offers a wine libation to idols, or from one who profanes the Sabbath publicly. Now this, Beretha, is self-contradictory. It says of you, but not all of you, thus excluding Meshumad. And then it says one may accept sacrifices from the transgressors in Israel. This is no difficulty. The former statement refers to one who is a Meshumad to reject the whole Torah, while the latter statement refers to one who is a Meshumad to reject one particular law.
Okay, so this is a little complicated, and we're gonna break it down, and hopefully everybody will understand. There's a verse right near the beginning of Leviticus, which says, when any of you present an offering to God, right? The word mikem is the word of you, okay? And this piece of the Talmud discusses the boundaries of who can participate in the sacrificial service. Now, not the ones who actually bring the offering on the altar, those are the Kohanim, the priests, right? But, you know, which Israelites can bring such a sacrifice and have it accepted, right? So there are some people who are in the deviance category, right? And they don't get to participate. So the way it is interpreted here, when it talks about a meshumad, by the way, anybody know what a meshumad means today? A meshumad is someone who basically converts out of Judaism. Yeah. Okay, that's a meshumad. Right?
Totally
Here,
rejecting the Torah.
yeah, so literally it means one who is destroyed, meaning, you know, we're done with them. If you convert out, I mean, you know, Yeshurun, you know, goodbye, right? Yeah, bye.
So that would be the equivalent of if I went and accepted baptism.
Yeah, basically.
Okay. Now, does Judaism, I don't think they did, but does Judaism have the equivalent of this fellowship? Can you get, like, some religions, like Jehovah's Witness, will actually throw you out,
Yeah.
officially throw you out?
There is a category which you never see today, and even very few ultra-Orthodox communities practice it. But the term is cherem, okay? Cherem means you are excommunicated. You are put into a category, we have nothing to do with you. We don't allow you to come into our synagogues. We don't, you know, we won't have anything to do with you, period. Right? Nowadays, you know, there aren't too many people who would utilize that category, right? You know, even a meshumad, somebody who converted, it doesn't mean that, you know, I wouldn't be courteous to them. It doesn't mean I have to run out of the room screaming when they walk in, right? Yeah, so, but this, it says, mikem, from, of you, and it doesn't say of all of you. So maybe that means there are some limits on it. So, and there are rabbinic teachings that suggest we accept sacrifices from sinners, right? Now, somebody committed a sin, maybe they want to bring a forgiveness offering, right? So, so which kinds of sin are so deviant that we won't have anything to do with them, and which kinds of sins are tolerated, right? So again, there would be certain meshumadim, plural, right, that we would not allow to participate in the Jewish community. Anybody got an example of that?
Pedophiles.
Pedophiles. Yeah, that's actually an interesting question. What do you do with someone who hasn't actually, he hasn't denied Judaism, but you don't want him around?
Is it in jail?
Maybe, but let's say they're out of jail, okay? They've done 20 years in jail, but, they still fit into this category of people that, they're registered sex offenders, right? And so, what do you do with them? That's more complicated, right? Another example, right? Someone who claims to be a Jew, but who is actually known to be a Christian. Like Messianic,
Oh,
yeah, Hebrew Christian phenomenon, right? Or the so-called Jews for Jesus group, right? So, would we accept such a person into the community? No.
I hope not.
No,
No.
absolutely not, right? That's, we live in a free country. People can say what they want, they can claim what they want, but as far as, our setting the boundaries for our community, we say they're not within it. And we're very serious about that. Anybody who we have any suspicion about fitting in that category, we would check it out before we would allow them to join the synagogue, right? Especially since they probably would have interesting motivations.
Rabbi,
Right.
he was first.
Yeah, George.
Over here in southwest Houston, there's a Messianic Jewish.
I'm aware.
And I've seen some of those people come to the Orthodox synagogue. They're very suspicious, The rabbis there, they won't give them a read or anything. They let them come in, as long as they don't see they're trying to proselytize anybody,
Yeah, and I think that's generally how we operate also.
But usually those people kind of give up after a few times. They figure out it's not working.
Well, they also realize that, especially if they're going to an Orthodox synagogue, they're not gonna be very successful there, right? They're probably not gonna be very successful at Beth Yeshurun, right? My way of dealing with them is, if they insist on having a conversation with me, is that, so my understanding is you would rather there not be any Jews in the world, is that correct? And if they're honest, they will have to say, yes, well, because, we want them all to convert. So at that point, I say, well, if you don't want there to be any Jews in the world, I have nothing to do with you. I have nothing to say to you. Okay? Okay, so at any rate, there are certain special cases here, in what the Talmud says, idolatry, right? Idolatry, in the Ten Commandments, that's pretty serious. Public desecration of Shabbat, now that's also in the Ten Commandments. And, we might be a little more liberal about what we consider to be desecration of Shabbat. But at least in theory, we would put that in the deviance category too, yeah, right.
What is B'nai Noah?
So B'nai Noach is a whole separate category of non-Jews who accept what we consider to be the 7 binding laws on all people, not just Jews. Right? So they are called the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 commandments of all people.
Are they considered Jewish?
No.
But they don't even say they're Jews.
You're right, they don't necessarily claim it. Okay, text number 3, right? From the Passover Haggadah, so this should be familiar, right? Who would like to read this piece? Okay, so, go ahead.
The wicked one, what does he say? What is this service to you? He says to you, but not to him. By thus excluding himself from the community, he is a heretic in the essence. You therefore blunt his teeth and say to him, it is because of this that the Lord did for me when I left Egypt. For me, but not for him. If he had been there, he would not have been redeemed.
So according to this passage, what's the essence of heresy here in the Jewish tradition? Right?
Well, he removed himself from the Jewish community.
Yes. Yeah. That if you exclude yourself from the Jewish people, that's considered to be, like the knife in the heart. And that person excludes themselves from the community, essentially.
This is kind of what's written in the Haggadah.
This is from the Haggadah. Yeah. And so, if this is the essence of Judaism, that one identifies with the community, that might also say something about the previous text. When idolatry and public desecration of Shabbat were considered, special cases that you excluded yourself from the community, because in a time where everyone in the community kept certain things, then, by not doing them, you were excluding yourself, right? Now there is a much greater range of what is tolerated in Jewish community. People can claim to be Jewish even if they don't necessarily perform Jewish actions, right? As long as they don't deny the essence, if they don't convert to something else, right? Number 4, yeah, Karen.
I always had a different interpretation of this supposed wicked child. It seems to me you could easily think of asking your parent, what does the service mean to you? Like wanting to know what it means to them as their parents, as opposed to, totally excluding himself.
Yeah, that's not the way the rabbis read the text. Okay? I'm not arguing your point, because that's definitely a valid point. It is not the way the rabbis read that. And maybe that was a definite choice on the part of the rabbis in order to make a particular point.
Seems like it's always italicized.
You, right, because, part of the reason for that is it's from the Torah, right? Yeah, Ronnie?
In the Haggadah, what is the response? Because I always thought that the response was to convince the wicked one to understand, that this is what God did, He brought you out of Egypt. It was our responsibility to answer his question, and make him understand why his question is.
And that's the way I think I would treat it today,
Yeah.
but that is not the way the rabbis treated it when they put it into the Haggadah. Right? For particular reasons we don't need to go into. Okay? All right, text number 4. This is a little bit longer, so I'm going to read this one. Right? But again, this is from the Mishnah Torah of Maimonides, his law code. Right? Laws pertaining to rebels. Right? So this is definitely going to come into the territory of deviance. Right? someone who denies the validity of the oral law is one of the heretics who any person can kill. Right? So, really strict boundary, right? As soon as his denial of the oral law has been publicized, anyone can push him into a pit, and he is not to be helped out from it, just like the other sectarians and heretics and those who deny the divine origin of Torah, informers, really bad people, and apostates, all of whom are not considered to be part of the Jewish people. For such people, there is no requirement for witnesses to observe their actions, nor do they have to be warned. Like, normally, if you were accused of a crime, the first question the judges would ask is, was he warned that this was, unacceptable? And if he wasn't, they couldn't necessarily, do capital punishment. Right? Nor are judges required. Whoever kills such a person did a great deed and removed a stumbling block. This applies only to one who denies the oral law consciously, with reasoning that seemed valid to him, and thus followed his light mind and his capricious heart. But the children and grandchildren of anyone who erred, such as Karaites, right? Anybody know who the Karaites were?
I do.
Karaites, yes.
We still have a synagogue in California, there's like one left.
Okay, what's the key belief of the
They
Karaites?
don't believe in the power of the oral law, they're like sola scriptura.
Right, so this is exactly what Maimonides was talking about. They only believe in scripture, but not in rabbinic Judaism.
Right.
Okay? So, whose parents led them astray and were born into a heretical culture and were raised with these views, are considered in a different category. They are like a child captured by Gentiles and raised with their religion who was anus, meaning they were compelled unwittingly, right? Even if such a person later hears that he is actually Jewish and meets Jews and observes their practices, he is nevertheless considered an anus, compelled unwittingly. For he was raised with their mistaken practices and beliefs. Therefore, it is correct to bring them back in repentance, draw them close in a peaceful way to the power of the Torah, and not be hasty to murder. Right? Yeah, so, Maimonides has this really strict boundary, right? And why does he put the oral law in this intolerable, deviant category?
Because it's not divine.
Well, I mean, if you say it's not divine, then it's not, right? Maimonides regards it as divine. But it's not, it's not in scripture.
Yeah, it's not in scripture.
Right. So if you say you don't believe in the oral law, what you're saying is you don't believe in the Judaism we have today.
Right.
Because our Judaism is not biblical Judaism, that would be Karaite Judaism, right? That our Judaism is rabbinic Judaism, right? Hence, that is based on the oral law, and if you don't believe in that, according to Maimonides, you're out. And subject to a lot of danger, too. Now, by the way, this law would only apply in a land where Jewish law was the law of the land. Would never have applied any place Maimonides lived. Okay? So, he would never apply that, for instance, to our society. Very different, open society. But
There's Israel earlier.
he, operated on the theory that if there were a state conducted according to Jewish law, it would have this whole range of practices. This is why separation of church and state is actually a really good thing. Okay? Yeah.
Okay, so during the times in the Qumran, when they were doing all this research, they found all these people who practiced something that looked like Judaism, but there were things they didn't do, right? If you've ever seeing what they found with the Dead Sea Scrolls and all that.
Oh, yeah.
There were these sects there that under the Jewish state, but they didn't follow everything.
Yeah.
These people kind of went off in the corner and did whatever they wanted, and they didn't
Or-
recognize
or-
other people, right?
Yeah, I mean, and also, they didn't propagate. They believed in celibacy. Guess what happens to communities like that? Yeah, I mean, basically, communities like that come about because they believe that the coming of the Messiah is imminent, right? So then, you want to purify yourself from all human desires and so on and so forth. But that's why they die out. Okay, number 5, right? This is from Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, who lived late 19th, early 20th century. All right, someone want to read this piece for us?
Sure.
Go ahead.
There is, however, another basis for leniency, for in our generation one is not called a public desecrator of the Shabbat, given to the fact that the majority of the people do so, when the majority of Israel are innocent, and it is a minority who dare violate this prohibition regarding Shabbat, then one is a kofar in the Torah, a brazen performer of abominations, and an individual who separates him or herself from the community of Israel. However, given to the fact that as a result of our multitude of sins, the majority breach the barrier and desecrate the Shabbat in public, their deficiency is the source for their correction, for the individual thinks that it is not such a significant sin, and it need not be done in private. As a result, his or her public violation is as if it was done in private. Quite to the contrary, the God-fearing in our generation are considered as if they are separated and distinguished from the community, while the sinners function in a manner that is considered normal.
Right, so here is a case where the boundary of deviance shifts, right? Because you can't have, deviance that is intolerable if it involves the majority of the community or a substantial percentage of the community, right? So the boundary of what's tolerable and intolerable shifted, right? And so for Rabbi Hoffman, in modern times,
What year was that written?
so that was probably written around 1900,
Oh.
give or take, right? But it doesn't, because the shift in observance in the Jewish community was already happening before that, right? Especially in Germany where he lived, right? So, I mean, how many Jews in Germany in 1900 were really Orthodox or really observant, right? Now, there was a minority, definitely a minority. So you couldn't read out the majority from the community, right? So that's when, that's a case where the boundaries change, right? Now, how could we apply this principle to the conversation about Israel? Yes, it is, but, what's an example of something that once was considered a rejection of the Jewish people or Zionism, but is now much more widespread?
Maybe not.
The state of Israel itself. The state of Israel itself, right? The existence of the state of Israel itself.
Well, are you saying that now some people would say the state of Israel doesn't have a right to exist?
No, the opposite. The Orthodox Jews in the 1940s were dead set against Israel, and now they embrace it.
That's true, okay, because it became a fact, right? That's, however, a little bit different from what I'm looking for. Yeah, Ron?
Having non-Jews in the Knesset.
Having non-Jews in the Knesset. That's an interesting case, right? Because you might have said, well, this is the Jewish state. So maybe we're not going to give privileges, political privileges to non-Jews. Of course, that was not the case, right? There have always been non-Jews in the Knesset, because there have always been Arab parties, right?
It's a democratic state.
Because it's a democratic state, right? What was something that was considered a rejection of the Jewish people in the past? Yeah, Chris?
Secularism.
Okay, secularism, until the 18th century, was not even considered an option. It was not at all on the table. You couldn't just, stop being a Jew. You could convert to something else, but, and then, you would be shunned by your entire family and the entire Jewish community. But you couldn't just become secular, right? Because you would be, for that also, you would be shunned by the community, right?
And you would still be considered Jewish by the state within which you were living and discriminated against.
Yes, so you had all the disadvantages of being Jewish and none of the advantages, such as they were, right? The conversation about Israel, right? There are things that people might say which we might not agree with, but they would now be considered a legitimate part of the conversation. So for instance, if I want to say that the way the army behaves, Israeli army, okay, is unjust and intolerable, right? Now, I think that if you said something about that, something like that about the Israeli army in the time of the Six-Day War or the Yom Kippur War, that would have been seen as intolerable deviance. It would have been considered a vicious claim about the Israeli army. Because the Israeli army, and I think it is still generally true today, that the Israeli army has very high moral standards. Okay? But today, it is at least possible to claim that some behavior, and maybe a significant amount of the behavior towards Palestinians, is not moral, right? And you can, all you have to do is go on the internet and you can find examples of that.
That's through the government policy, though.
Well, of course, it's not government policy, although some people would say, and again, this is part of what's acceptable conversation now, right? Some people would say that it's an inevitable outgrowth of current policies, right?
Right.
I'm not saying this is so. I'm just saying that there are people who say it is so, and that has become tolerated conversation, right? It has moved over here. Certainly in this category, and maybe even, it's not deviance anymore. Because if you can substantiate it, then it's just a fact, and facts cannot be deviant. Right? Well, to some people, maybe they can, right? Because, fake news, right? But it's really hard to deny facts, right? There are exceptions these days, but we know. Yeah, sure.
Okay, in Tel Aviv, there was a nightclub where there was a bunch of kids celebrating whatever on Friday night, and some terrorists came across the border and killed a whole bunch of the kids.
Right,
And the Israeli government said this is not gonna happen again. And that, the outgrowth of that was, you see Shabbos, whatever the holiday is, you see people walking around armed military. They said, we cannot wait for the soldier to go home and go get his gun and protect the country.
So you may have heard me say this before. It's a story of a meeting that was held when they were getting more of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel to have women involved in the army or some form of national service, but even in the army. And so they had a meeting with people from the army, including some female soldiers. And the parents of these girls who were going to be going into the army in a year or two or whatever, right? And one of the fathers asks, are our daughters going to have to work on Shabbat? And this female soldier pipes up and says, of course, your daughters will have to work on Shabbat. Gam ha'oyev oved b'Shabbat. The enemy also works on Shabbat. Right? And when you put it like that, the father says, oh. Yeah.
They work on Kippur too.
Yeah, that's just, the facts that Israel has to live with, right?
So
So,
this was an Orthodox soldier.
yeah, absolutely. Long dress and all, right? Yeah, Karen.
What about people that consider Israel to be an occupier, or would that
Consider
be
Israel
Mhm.
something that?
So I think that
And occupy.
that also has shifted somewhat in the conversation. The idea that, we see it, historically, I can certainly make the argument that, Israel is not really an occupier in that sense because the presence of Israelis in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, is a result of a war that was waged against Israel, right? And the presence of Israelis in many parts of that area is to prevent, any kind of violence directed against Israel. Of course, there are also Jews who say, well, some of this land was ours before 1948, right? So there are members of Toby's family who survived the killing of most of the kibbutzniks in a place in the West Bank in 1948. Right? And so now, somebody comes along and says, oh, I think that's a settlement. Israelis shouldn't be establishing settlements in that area. Well, don't settle them. What does that mean, right? That mean we're doing wrong by going back to places where Jews lived before 1948? That's my response to a lot of fallacious arguments. Right? But to say that Israel is an occupying power, that has become part of the conversation, right? And it depends on what you mean by are the implications of that. We really have to stop here. So we're going to start Unit 3 next Sunday. Thank you.